The morning mist hung heavy over the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle as William made his way through the narrow corridors leading to the royal archives. His footsteps echoed softly against the cold marble floors, each step carrying the weight of a sleepless night filled with questions that had no answers. The events of the past week had shaken the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about his family, his heritage, and, most importantly, about himself. William pushed open the heavy oak door to the archives, breathing in the familiar scent of old parchment, leather bindings, and centuries of carefully preserved history. This had always been his sanctuary, the place where he came to find solace among the documented truths of generations past. Today, however, the usually comforting atmosphere felt different, charged with an electricity that made his skin crawl with anticipation and dread. Margaret Thornfield, the head archivist, looked up from her desk with surprise etched across her weathered face. Her silver hair was pulled back in its usual tight bun, and her wire-rimmed glasses caught the light from the tall windows that lined the eastern wall. She had been working in these archives for over 30 years, had known William since he was a curious young boy sneaking into restricted sections to read about his ancestors. "Your Highness," she said, rising quickly from her chair with a slight curtsy. "I wasn't expecting you this early. Is everything all right?" William managed a weak smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. The dark circles beneath them told the story of too many sleepless nights, too many unanswered questions eating away at his peace of mind. "Good morning, Margaret. I need to examine the documents from the fire again. All of them." Margaret's expression grew serious. She had been present 3 days ago when the discovery was made, had seen the look of horror that crossed William's face when they found what remained of the burned papers hidden behind a loose stone in the archive's oldest section. The charred fragments had been carefully preserved, but most were too damaged to read. "Most, but not all." "Of course, Your Highness. I've prepared everything in the restoration room." Dr. Patterson arrived early this morning with his equipment. Margaret gathered a set of keys from her desk drawer, each one worn smooth from decades of use. "If I may ask, have you told anyone else about what we found?" William shook his head slowly, his jaw tightening. "Not yet. I need to be certain before I make any accusations. Too much depends on getting this right." They walked through a series of increasingly narrow hallways, past countless shelves lined with documents that chronicled centuries of royal history. Birth certificates, death records, marriage contracts, treaties, letters, diaries, all the intimate details of lives lived in the spotlight of power. William had spent countless hours in these halls as a young man, fascinated by the stories of his ancestors, both their triumphs and their failures. The restoration room was located in the deepest part of the archives, a climate-controlled space where the most delicate documents were brought for preservation and analysis. Dr. Jonathan Patterson, a forensic document expert from Oxford, looked up as they entered. His equipment was spread across several tables, including high-powered magnifying devices, chemical analysis tools, and specialized cameras capable of revealing text that had been obscured by fire damage. "Your Highness," Dr. Patterson said with a respectful nod, "I've made significant progress since yesterday. The fragments you discovered are indeed quite old, dating back approximately 40 years based on the paper composition and ink analysis." William felt his heart race. 40 years ago would place the creation of these documents right around the time of his birth, during one of the most turbulent periods in recent royal history. His parents' marriage had been under intense scrutiny, with rumors and speculation following their every move. The press had been relentless, and the pressure on the royal family had been immense. "What have you been able to recover?" William asked, approaching the central table where the charred fragments lay under protective glass. Dr. Patterson adjusted his glasses and picked up a small pointer. "We've identified several partial sentences, names, and what appears to be a date. Here," he said, pointing to a larger fragment near the center of the collection, "you can see what looks like part of a signature. The writing style suggests it was written by someone with formal education, possibly someone within the royal household or court. William leaned closer, squinting at the faded marks on the burned paper. The handwriting was elegant, but hurried, as if the author had been writing under pressure or in secret. He could make out parts of words, fragments of thoughts that had been preserved by chance when the papers had been hidden away before the fire could completely consume them. Margaret stood beside him, her expression grave. "Your Highness, there's something else. When we were examining the hiding place where these were found, we discovered scratches on the stone that suggest the documents were hidden hastily, possibly during an emergency." "What kind of emergency?" William asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Based on our research into the castle's records, there was a small fire in this section of the archives exactly 40 years ago," Dr. Patterson explained. The official report stated that it was an accident caused by faulty wiring in one of the older storage rooms. However, the fire occurred at night when the archives were supposed to be empty. William felt a chill run down his spine. A fire at night, documents hastily hidden, and now fragments that appeared to contain information from the most sensitive period of his family's recent history. The pieces were starting to form a picture, though he wasn't sure he wanted to see the complete image. "Have you been able to determine what these documents were about?" he asked. Dr. Patterson exchanged a look with Margaret before answering. "From what we can piece together, they appear to be correspondence of some kind. Personal letters, perhaps, or internal memoranda. Here," he pointed to another fragment, "we can see what appears to be a reference to medical records, and this section mentions something about the truth and protecting the crown." William's hands began to tremble slightly. Medical records from 40 years ago could only mean one thing. They were related to his birth, to the circumstances surrounding his arrival into the world. But why would medical records need to be destroyed? Why would someone go to such lengths to hide the truth? Is there anything else? Any other clues about who might have written these or why they were destroyed? Margaret reached for a folder on the side table. "We've been researching the staff records from that time period, trying to identify who would have had access to this section of the archives during the night of the fire." She opened the folder and spread several employee files across the table. There were only 5 people with keys to this area 40 years ago. William studied the files, recognizing some of the names. 2 were long-dead archivists. One was a security guard who had retired decades ago, and the other 2 names made his blood run cold. One was Sir Henry Ashworth, his grandfather's private secretary and one of the most trusted advisors to the royal family. The other was Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the royal physician who had attended his birth. "Sir Henry and Dr. Hartwell," William whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're both still alive." "Yes, Your Highness," Margaret confirmed quietly. "Sir Henry retired 10 years ago, but still lives in his cottage on the Sandringham estate. Dr. Hartwell moved to Scotland after her retirement, but she maintains her medical license and occasionally consults on historical medical cases." William stared at the names, his mind racing through the implications. These 2 people had been present during the most important moments of his early life, had been trusted with the most intimate secrets of the royal family. If they were involved in destroying documents related to his birth, there had to be a reason, a secret so dangerous that it required the destruction of evidence and the silence of decades. "I need to speak with them," William said finally, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his stomach. "Both of them. But I need to be careful about how I approach this." Dr. Patterson cleared his throat softly. "Your Highness, there is one more thing. We found traces of an accelerant on some of the fragments. This fire wasn't accidental. Someone deliberately tried to destroy these documents." The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. William felt the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around him. Everything he had believed about his birth, his legitimacy, his place in the royal succession, all of it might be built on lies and cover-ups. Margaret stepped forward, her voice gentle but concerned. "Your Highness, perhaps it would be wise to involve others in this investigation. Your private secretary, or perhaps legal counsel." William shook his head firmly. "No, not yet. If there's a conspiracy involved, I don't know how far it reaches or who else might be implicated. He paused, running his hands through his hair in frustration. I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with before I involve anyone else. He looked back at the charred fragments, at the partial words and faded ink that held the key to secrets that had been buried for 4 decades. Somewhere in those burned pieces of paper was the truth about his past, about decisions made in the shadows that had shaped his entire life. Dr. Patterson, how long will it take you to recover everything possible from these fragments? With the equipment I have here, perhaps another week to 10 days. We're using advanced imaging techniques to reveal text that isn't visible to the naked eye and chemical analysis to restore faded ink. It's a delicate process, but we should be able to recover most of the readable content. Good. Continue your work, but keep this absolutely confidential. Margaret, I need you to research everything you can find about Sir Henry and Dr. Hartwell from that time period. Their schedules, their access records, anything that might tell us where they were on the night of the fire. Margaret nodded solemnly. Of course, Your Highness. And what about the official fire report? Should I request the original investigation files? Yes, but do it quietly. Use your regular research protocols so it doesn't raise any red flags. William took one last look at the fragments before turning toward the door. I'm going to pay a visit to Sir Henry. If these documents contained secrets worth destroying, he would know about them. As William made his way back through the archives, his mind was already planning his approach to Sir Henry Ashworth. The old man had always been kind to him, had treated him with grandfatherly affection during William's childhood visits to the estate. But now William had to consider the possibility that this kindness had been built on deception, that Sir Henry had been protecting a lie for 40 years. The walk back to his private quarters gave William time to think about the larger implications of what he had discovered. If documents related to his birth had been deliberately destroyed, it suggested that there were secrets about his legitimacy, his parentage, or the circumstances of his arrival that someone had deemed too dangerous to preserve. In a monarchy where bloodline and legitimacy were everything, such secrets could destroy not just his own future, but the entire foundation of the institution itself. By the time William reached his study, he had made his decision. He would confront Sir Henry directly, but carefully. He would watch the old man's reactions, listen not just to what he said, but to what he didn't say. After decades in royal service, Sir Henry would be skilled at deflecting uncomfortable questions, but William had learned a few things about reading people during his years in public service. William sat at his desk and pulled out a piece of personal stationery. He would write to Sir Henry, requesting a private meeting under the guise of seeking advice about historical matters. It would seem natural enough. William was known for his interest in royal history, and Sir Henry had always enjoyed sharing stories about the past. As he began to write, William's hand paused over the paper. Once he sent this letter, there would be no going back. He would be stepping into a labyrinth of secrets and lies that had been carefully constructed to hide the truth. But he had no choice. The charred fragments in the archives were proof that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal something about his past. He needed to know what it was, regardless of the consequences. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade as William finished his letter to Sir Henry. He sealed it in an envelope and marked it for personal delivery. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey toward uncovering the truth about his birth, about the fire that had destroyed the evidence, and about the people who had kept these secrets for 40 years. As he sat in his study, watching the shadows lengthen across the grounds of Windsor Castle, William couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. The charred page that had turned up in the archives was more than just a burned piece of paper. It was the first thread in a web of deception that might unravel everything he had ever believed about himself and his place in the world. The weight of potential truth pressed down on him like a physical force. Tomorrow, he would begin asking questions that might have answers he wasn't prepared to hear. But the boy who had once hidden in these very archives to read forbidden stories about his ancestors had grown into a man who understood that truth, however painful, was always preferable to living a lie. William folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. Sir Henry Ashworth would receive it first thing in the morning, and within days, William would have the first real answers about the mystery that had been hidden in the royal archives for 40 years. Whether those answers would destroy him or set him free remained to be seen, but he was determined to face whatever truth awaited him in the cottage on the Sandringham estate. The drive to Sandringham took William through countryside that he had known since childhood, past rolling hills and ancient oak trees that had witnessed centuries of royal history. But today, the familiar landscape felt foreign to him, as if he were seeing it through different eyes. The weight of the letter in his jacket pocket seemed to grow heavier with each mile, and by the time he reached the estate gates, his hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Sir Henry had responded to William's request with characteristic warmth and efficiency. His reply, written in the same elegant handwriting that William remembered from childhood, had arrived within hours of William's letter being delivered. The old man had expressed delight at the prospect of a visit, and had suggested they meet at his cottage rather than in the main house, away from the usual formalities and interruptions that came with official royal visits. The cottage sat at the edge of a small wood, surrounded by carefully tended gardens that showed the attention of someone who had time to nurture beauty for its own sake. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the windows glowed with warm yellow light against the gray afternoon sky. It looked like a scene from a fairy tale, peaceful and welcoming, making it hard for William to believe that within these walls might lie the answers to questions that could destroy his world. William parked his car behind a screen of hedges, partly from habit and partly because he wanted to keep this visit as private as possible. He had driven himself rather than using his usual security detail, telling them only that he was making an informal visit to an old family friend. The fewer people who knew about this meeting, the better. Sir Henry opened the door before William had a chance to knock, as if he had been watching for his arrival. The old man was exactly as William remembered him, tall and dignified despite his 83 years, with silver hair perfectly combed and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to see everything. He wore a simple tweed jacket over a cream-colored sweater, clothes that spoke of comfort and retirement from the formal world of royal protocol. "William, my dear boy," Sir Henry said, his face breaking into a genuine smile as he stepped forward to embrace his visitor. "How wonderful to see you. Come in, come in. I've prepared tea, just the way you liked it as a child." The interior of the cottage was exactly what William had expected. Comfortable furniture arranged around a stone fireplace, walls lined with books, family photographs scattered on every available surface. It was the home of someone who had lived a full life and was content to spend his remaining years surrounded by memories and simple pleasures. "You look tired, William," Sir Henry observed as he led the way to a pair of armchairs positioned near the fire. "The responsibilities of your position weighing heavily." William settled into the offered chair, accepting the cup of tea that Sir Henry poured from a silver service that probably dated back decades. The familiar ritual of afternoon tea gave him a moment to observe his host, looking for any sign of nervousness or discomfort. But Sir Henry appeared completely at ease, genuinely pleased to have company. "Actually, Sir Henry, I've been spending quite a bit of time in the royal archives recently," William began carefully, watching for any reaction. "I've always been fascinated by our family history, as you know." "Indeed," Sir Henry chuckled, settling back in his own chair with his teacup balanced on his knee. "I remember you as a boy, always asking questions about your ancestors, wanting to know the stories behind the official portraits. Your curiosity was one of your most endearing qualities. Recently, Margaret Thornfield and I have been examining some documents that were damaged in an old fire," William continued, his voice casual despite the tension he felt. "Papers from about 40 years ago. I wonder if you remember anything about a fire in the archives from that time period?" For just a moment, William thought he saw something flicker in Sir Henry's eyes, a brief shadow of concern or perhaps recognition. But it passed so quickly that William couldn't be certain he hadn't imagined it. A fire in the archives? Sir Henry repeated thoughtfully, setting down his teacup and staring into the flames dancing in the fireplace. Yes, I do recall something like that. It was a minor incident, if I remember correctly. Electrical problems in one of the older sections. That's what the official report said, William agreed. But the documents we've recovered suggest that it might not have been accidental. This time, there was no mistaking Sir Henry's reaction. The old man's hand tightened slightly on the arm of his chair, and he turned to look directly at William with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been fear. "What do you mean, not accidental?" Sir Henry asked, his voice still controlled, but lacking the warmth it had carried moments before. William reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder containing photographs of the charred fragments. He had debated whether to bring them, but had decided that a direct approach might be more effective than dancing around the subject. Dr. Patterson found traces of accelerant on some of the fragments. Someone deliberately set those documents on fire. Sir Henry stared at the photographs for a long moment without reaching for them, as if they might burn him if he touched them. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Where did you find these?" "Hidden behind a loose stone in the archives. They were placed there hastily, probably during the fire, by someone who wanted to save at least some evidence before it could be completely destroyed." William leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Sir Henry's face. "The question is, evidence of what?" The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm. Sir Henry seemed to age 10 years in the span of those quiet moments, his shoulders sagging as if a tremendous weight had suddenly settled upon them. When he finally looked up at William, his eyes were filled with a sadness so profound that it took William's breath away. "I'd hoped this day would never come," Sir Henry said quietly. "For 40 years, I've prayed that the truth would remain buried, that you would never have to know." William felt his heart stop. "Know what?" Sir Henry stood slowly and walked to a cabinet on the far side of the room. From a drawer that required 2 keys to open, he withdrew a thick envelope that appeared to have been sealed for decades. His hand shook slightly as he returned to his chair, holding the envelope as if it contained something precious and dangerous. "Before I show you this, William, I need you to understand the circumstances we were facing 40 years ago. Your parents' marriage was under enormous strain, the press was relentless, and there were threats to the stability of the monarchy itself." Sir Henry's voice was steady now, but filled with the weight of years of carrying a terrible burden. "What kind of threats?" William asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Questions about legitimacy, about bloodlines, about the fitness of your parents to rule." Sir Henry opened the envelope carefully and withdrew several documents that appeared to be copies of medical records and official correspondence. "There were rumors, William. Terrible rumors that threatened to tear the royal family apart." William's hands were shaking now as he reached for the documents. The first was a medical report dated 2 days after his birth, signed by Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell. As he read, the carefully constructed world of his childhood began to crumble around him. According to the report, there had been complications during his birth that had required emergency procedures. But more disturbing were the notes about unusual circumstances and questions requiring immediate consultation with senior royal advisors. The language was clinical, but urgent, suggesting that something had gone wrong in ways that extended far beyond medical concerns. The second document was a memorandum from Sir Henry himself to William's grandfather, marked most secret and dated 1 week after William's birth. William read it with growing horror as the implications became clear. "The infant's blood type presents complications regarding established paternity records," the memo read. "Dr. Hartwell has confirmed the results 3 times. Immediate consultation with legal advisors required regarding succession implications." William looked up at Sir Henry with shock and disbelief. "Blood type? What complications?" Sir Henry's voice was heavy with 40 years of regret. "Your father's blood type made it genetically impossible for him to be your biological father, William. The medical evidence was irrefutable." The words hit William like a physical blow. He felt the room spinning around him as the implications crashed over him in waves. If his father wasn't his biological father, then his place in the line of succession was illegitimate. Everything about his life, his identity, his future, all of it was built on a lie. But that's impossible, William whispered, his voice barely audible. The marriage was legitimate. My mother was never unfaithful. Everyone knows that. Sir Henry's expression was filled with compassion and sorrow. Your mother was faithful, William. She never betrayed your father or the crown. But there's something else, something that we discovered in the weeks following your birth that explained everything. William waited, afraid to breathe, afraid to hear what came next. Your father is not who you think he is, Sir Henry said gently. The man who raised you, who loves you as his son, is your biological father. But he is not the biological son of your grandfather. The revelation was so shocking that William felt as if the ground had opened beneath him. He stared at Sir Henry in complete incomprehension, unable to process what he was hearing. What are you saying? William managed to ask. Your grandfather had an affair 30 years before your birth, with a woman who worked in the royal household. She became pregnant, but the affair was hushed up, and she was sent away. The child was raised in secret by adoptive parents who were loyal to the crown. Sir Henry paused, letting the information sink in. That child was the man you call your father. William felt his world tilting on its axis. The implications were staggering. If his father was not legitimate, then William's own claim to the throne was doubly complicated. But at the same time, it explained why the blood types hadn't matched. The genetic incompatibility was one generation removed. Why are you telling me this now? William asked, his voice hollow with shock. Because someone else knows, Sir Henry replied grimly. 3 days ago, I received a phone call from someone claiming to have evidence about your family's legitimacy. They want money, a substantial amount, in exchange for keeping quiet. William felt a cold chill run down his spine. Blackmail? Yes. And if they have proof of what I've just told you, they could destroy not just your future, but the entire monarchy. The constitutional crisis alone would be devastating. William stared into the fire, watching the flames dance as his mind raced through the implications. Everything he had believed about himself, about his family, about his destiny had been turned upside down in the space of a few minutes. But there was something else, something that didn't quite fit. The documents in the archives, William said slowly. If you and Dr. Hartwell knew the truth, why destroy the evidence? Why not just keep it secure? Sir Henry's face darkened. Because we weren't the only ones who knew. There was someone else, someone who had access to the medical records and the investigation files. Someone who we feared might use the information for their own purposes. Who? James Morrison, one of the junior archivists at the time. He had discovered some of the early correspondence about the blood type discrepancies and had begun asking questions. We were afraid he might try to use the information to advance his own position, or worse, sell it to the press. William felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. So you destroyed the documents to keep them away from Morrison. We tried to, but the fire got out of control faster than we expected. We managed to hide some of the evidence, but we weren't sure what Morrison might have taken before we discovered his involvement. Sir Henry leaned forward, his expression grave. William, James Morrison disappeared the night of the fire. He was never seen again. The implications of this revelation sent a chill through William's bones. You think he's dead? I don't know. But if he's alive, and if he's the one making the blackmail demands now, then he's had 40 years to plan his revenge. And he knows exactly how to destroy your family. William stood abruptly, pacing to the window as he tried to process everything he had learned. The peaceful garden outside looked surreal now, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted in his understanding of his own life. What do the blackmailers want? William asked without turning around. £5 million transferred to an offshore account. In exchange, they promised to destroy all evidence and never contact the royal family again. And you believe them? Sir Henry's laugh was bitter. Of course not. Blackmailers never stop with the first payment. They'll be back for more, again and again, until either the money runs out or the secret becomes public anyway. William turned back to face the old man who had helped shape his childhood, who had just shattered every assumption William had ever held about his own identity. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you need to find out who's behind this before they make their demands public. And you need to decide whether the truth is worth preserving the monarchy, or whether the monarchy is worth preserving in spite of the truth." As William prepared to leave the cottage, his mind was already racing ahead to the next steps he would need to take. The blackmailer's identity was the key to everything. If it was indeed James Morrison, then William needed to understand what had driven the man to disappear for 40 years only to emerge now with demands that could topple the crown. But there was something else troubling William, something that Sir Henry's story hadn't fully explained. If the truth about his father's legitimacy had been known to only a few people, how had Morrison discovered it? And why had he waited 4 decades to act on the information? The drive back to Windsor gave William time to think about the conversation with Sir Henry, to examine every word and gesture for additional clues. The old man had seemed genuinely relieved to finally share the burden he had carried for so many years, but William couldn't shake the feeling that there were still pieces of the story missing. By the time William reached the castle, he had made several decisions. First, he would have Margaret research everything she could find about James Morrison's disappearance. Second, he would arrange a meeting with Dr. Hartwell to get her version of events. And third, he would prepare for the possibility that the blackmailer might not be content to wait for a response to their demands. As he walked through the corridors of Windsor Castle, past portraits of ancestors who might or might not share his blood, William reflected on the cruel irony of his situation. He had always been proud of his royal heritage, had felt the weight and responsibility of his bloodline as both a privilege and a burden. Now he was learning that the bloodline he had revered might be built on lies and cover-ups that stretched back generations. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that someone out there knew all of this, had known it for 40 years, and was now prepared to use it as a weapon against everything William held dear. The charred page that had turned up in the archives was more than just evidence of a decades-old fire. It was proof that the past never truly stays buried, and that secrets have a way of rising from the ashes when least expected. The train journey to Edinburgh gave William time to prepare for what might be the most difficult conversation of his life. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell had agreed to meet with him, though her voice on the phone had carried a tremor that suggested she knew why he was coming. The woman who had brought him into the world 40 years ago was now the keeper of secrets that could determine whether he would ever ascend to the throne he had been born to inherit. William stared out the window at the Scottish countryside rushing past, his mind returning again and again to the documents Sir Henry had shown him. The medical report with its cryptic references to unusual circumstances had been haunting his thoughts for days. But there were questions that Sir Henry either couldn't or wouldn't answer, details that only Dr. Hartwell would know. The blackmailer's deadline was approaching fast. In less than a week, if the demands weren't met, the person claiming to have evidence about William's legitimacy had threatened to release their information to the international press. William had spent sleepless nights imagining the headlines, the constitutional crisis that would follow, the damage to an institution that had survived wars, scandals, and centuries of political upheaval. Dr. Hartwell lived in a converted farmhouse outside Edinburgh, surrounded by hills that rolled away toward the horizon in shades of green and gold. William had expected to find her in a typical retirement cottage, but the house was larger and more impressive than he had anticipated. The woman who opened the door was still recognizable as the physician who had attended royal birth for decades, though time had added silver to her dark hair and lines around her intelligent brown eyes. "Your Highness," she said with a formal curtsy that seemed automatic after years of royal protocol. "Please come in. I prepared tea in the sitting room." The interior of the house reflected the mind of someone who had spent her life in careful observation and meticulous record-keeping. Medical journals lined the walls, and Family photographs showed a woman who had balanced a demanding career with raising 3 children of her own. But William noticed something else: security features that seemed excessive for a retired doctor living in rural Scotland. "You have quite an impressive home," William observed as they settled in comfortable chairs near a large window overlooking the hills. Dr. Hartwell's smile was thin and didn't reach her eyes. After 40 years of royal service, one learns to appreciate both privacy and security. There have been incidents over the years. People seeking information about my former patients. William felt a chill at her words. "What kind of incidents?" "Phone calls, mostly. Letters requesting medical records that I don't possess. A few years ago, someone tried to break into my previous home in Surrey. Nothing was taken, but my medical files were searched through." Dr. Hartwell poured tea with hands that shook slightly. "I assume your visit is related to the questions that have been pursuing me for 4 decades. William set down his teacup and looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had been present at the most important moment of his life. "Dr. Hartwell, I need to know the truth about my birth. All of it." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of years of carefully guarded secrets. Dr. Hartwell stood and walked to a writing desk in the corner of the room, from which she withdrew a leather portfolio that appeared to have been waiting for this moment. "I've kept my own records, separate from the official files," she said quietly. "I knew that someday someone would need to know what really happened." She returned to her chair, holding the portfolio like a shield. "But before I show you these, you need to understand the pressure we were all under at the time. Sir Henry told me about the blood type incompatibility," William said, "but there's still things that don't make sense." Dr. Hartwell opened the portfolio and withdrew several documents, including what appeared to be her personal notes from William's birth. "The blood type issue was just the beginning, Your Highness. There were other complications that night, medical emergencies that required immediate decisions." She handed him a sheet of paper covered in her neat handwriting, dated the night of his birth. As William read, he felt the room growing cold around him despite the warmth from the fireplace. "Emergency cesarean section required due to fetal distress," the notes read. "Infant male born 11:47 p.m. Significant respiratory complications requiring immediate intervention. Father not present due to circumstances unknown to medical staff." William looked up sharply. "My father wasn't present at my birth?" Dr. Hartwell's expression was grim. "Your father was dealing with a crisis of his own that night. There had been an incident earlier in the day, something that had required his immediate attention and couldn't be postponed even for the birth of his heir." "What kind of incident?" "A car accident involving someone very important to the royal family. Someone whose identity had to be kept secret." Dr. Hartwell paused, choosing her words carefully. "The woman who was your father's biological mother had come forward that very day, threatening to reveal her identity unless certain demands were met." William felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. She chose that specific day to make contact. Wasn't coincidence. She had been monitoring the situation, waiting for the moment when her revelation would have maximum impact. The birth of the heir apparent seemed like the perfect time to demand recognition for her own son's legitimacy. William stared at the medical notes, trying to comprehend the chaos that must have surrounded his arrival into the world. What happened to her? She died in the car accident while en route to the palace. The roads were icy, and her driver lost control while trying to evade photographers who had somehow learned of her journey. Dr. Hartwell's voice was heavy with old sadness. "Your father spent the first hours of your life dealing with the aftermath of her death and the investigation that followed. The implications of this revelation were staggering. William's grandmother, a woman he had never known existed, had died on the night of his birth, taking with her any hope of resolving the questions about his father's legitimacy through direct testimony. But you still had the blood type evidence," William pointed out. "Yes, but there was something else, something that complicated the medical picture even further." Dr. Hartwell withdrew another document from her portfolio, this one appearing to be a laboratory report. "The blood test revealed something unexpected about your mother as well." William's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" Your mother had been taking medication for a condition she had kept secret from everyone, including your father. The medication could have affected the pregnancy in ways we didn't fully understand at the time. Dr. Hartwell handed him the lab report. She was being treated for a genetic disorder that could have implications for any children she might have. William scanned the medical terminology, most of which was incomprehensible to him. What kind of genetic disorder? One that affects blood clotting and could potentially be passed to offspring. At the time, we didn't know whether you had inherited the condition, and the medication your mother was taking made it impossible to conduct accurate paternity tests using the methods available 40 years ago. The complexity of the medical situation was overwhelming, but William was beginning to understand why the official records had been so carefully guarded. So you couldn't actually prove that my father wasn't my biological father? The blood type incompatibility was suggestive, but not conclusive given your mother's medical treatment. However, there were people who wanted to use the uncertainty to challenge the entire line of succession. Dr. Hartwell leaned forward, her expression intense. That's why we made the decision to destroy the ambiguous evidence and create a clear official record. William felt a mixture of relief and anger washing over him. You falsified medical records? We omitted details that could be misinterpreted by people with political motivations. The core facts remained true. You were born healthy, you were the legitimate heir, and you had every right to your place in the succession. Dr. Hartwell's voice carried the conviction of someone who had spent 40 years justifying difficult decisions. But we knew that in the wrong hands, the medical complexities could be twisted into weapons against the monarchy. William stood and walked to the window, staring out at the rolling hills as he tried to process everything he had learned. The truth was more complicated than he had imagined, involving not just questions about his father's legitimacy, but also his mother's secret medical condition and the death of a grandmother he had never known existed. Dr. Hartwell, there's something else I need to know. Do you remember a junior archivist named James Morrison? The change in Dr. Hartwell's expression was immediate and dramatic. Her face went pale, and she clutched the arms of her chair as if she might fall. Where did you hear that name? Sir Henry told me that Morrison had discovered some of the early correspondence about the blood type discrepancies, that he disappeared the night of the archive fire. Dr. Hartwell closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were filled with fear that had been carefully hidden for decades. James Morrison didn't disappear, Your Highness. He was killed. The words hit William like a physical blow. Killed? By whom? I don't know for certain, but I have my suspicions. Dr. Hartwell stood and walked to a window that overlooked the road leading to her house. Morrison had been asking questions, not just about the medical records, but about your grandmother's death. He believed there was a connection between her car accident and the archive fire. William felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. Was there a connection? Morrison thought so. He had discovered that the same person who arranged for your grandmother's transportation to the palace that night also had access to the archives. Someone who might have had reasons to want both her and the evidence destroyed. Who? William demanded. Dr. Hartwell turned back to face him, her expression grim. Sir Charles Pemberton, your grandfather's chief of staff. He's the one who coordinated all the security arrangements, who had access to everything, and who would have had the most to lose if the questions about legitimacy became public. William felt the room spinning around him. Sir Charles had been a fixture of his childhood, a kindly man who had always treated William with affection and respect. The idea that he might have been involved in murder was almost incomprehensible. But Sir Charles died years ago, William said weakly. Yes, but his records didn't. Morrison believed that Sir Charles had kept detailed files about all his activities, including evidence of his involvement in your grandmother's death and the destruction of the archives. Morrison was trying to find those files when he was killed. The implications of this revelation were terrifying. If Morrison had been murdered to protect secrets about William's family, then the current blackmail attempt might be coming from someone who had access to Sir Charles's hidden files. Dr. Hartwell, Do you think Morrison's killer is still alive? I think the person currently threatening your family knows exactly what happened 40 years ago, and they've been waiting for the right moment to use that knowledge. Dr. Hartwell returned to her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 78 years. Sir Charles had an assistant, someone who helped him with his most sensitive work. If anyone would have access to his private files, it would be that person. William felt pieces of the puzzle falling into place with sickening clarity. Who was the assistant? Margaret Thornfield. The name hit William like a thunderbolt. Margaret, the head archivist who had discovered the charred fragments, who had been helping with his investigation, who had access to everything in the Royal Archives. The woman he had trusted completely was potentially the same person who was now threatening to destroy his family. Are you certain? William asked, though he already knew the answer. Margaret worked closely with Sir Charles for 5 years before she moved to the archives. She would have known about all his activities, would have had access to his files, and would have understood the significance of every document in the royal collection. Dr. Hartwell's voice was heavy with the weight of a terrible realization. If she's behind the current threats, she has the knowledge and the access to do tremendous damage. William felt a mixture of betrayal and fear washing over him. The woman who had been like a surrogate grandmother to him, who had encouraged his love of royal history, who had seemed so genuinely concerned about the charred fragments. She had been manipulating him from the beginning. I have to go, William said abruptly, reaching for his jacket. If Margaret is behind this, I need to stop her before the deadline expires. Dr. Hartwell caught his arm as he headed for the door. Your Highness, be careful. If Margaret was involved in Morrison's death, she won't hesitate to eliminate anyone else who threatens her plans. The train journey back to London felt like the longest hours of William's life. He tried calling the Royal Archives several times, but Margaret wasn't answering her phone. By the time he reached Windsor Castle, darkness had fallen, and the ancient walls looked more forbidding than he had ever seen them. The archives were empty when William arrived, but Margaret's desk showed signs of recent activity. Papers were scattered across the surface, and several file drawers stood open as if someone had been searching through them hastily. On the desk, William found a note written in Margaret's familiar handwriting. Your Highness, it read, if you are reading this, you have learned more than I intended you to know. The truth about your family is more complex than even Sir Henry and Dr. Hartwell understand. Meet me in the vault at midnight if you want to hear the complete story before I make my final decision about what to do with the evidence. Come alone, or the information becomes public immediately. William looked at his watch. It was 11:30. In 30 minutes, he would finally face the woman who had shaped his understanding of royal history, who had access to secrets that could destroy everything he held dear. But he also realized that Margaret Thornfield might be the only person alive who knew the complete truth about the night he was born and the decades of deception that had followed. As he made his way toward the vault deep beneath the archives, William reflected on the cruel irony that his quest for truth had led him back to where it all began, in the dark corners of the Royal Archives, where secrets lay hidden among the official records of centuries of royal history. Whatever Margaret had to tell him, whatever evidence she possessed, his life would never be the same after tonight. The charred page that had started this entire investigation had been more than just a burned document. It had been the first crack in a carefully constructed facade that was now crumbling around him, revealing truths that were more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined. The vault beneath the Royal Archives was a place William had never seen before, though he had spent countless hours in the floors above. The narrow stone staircase descended into darkness that seemed to swallow his flashlight beam, and the air grew colder with each step. Ancient stones lined the walls, some bearing carved dates that stretched back centuries, marking the foundations of secrets that had been buried long before his family's current crisis. When William reached the bottom of the stairs, he found Margaret Thornfield waiting for him in a circular chamber that appeared to have been carved from the bedrock beneath Windsor Castle. She stood beside a wooden table that held several oil lamps, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The warm yellow light seemed inadequate against the overwhelming darkness that pressed in from all sides. Margaret looked older than he had ever seen her, as if the weight of 40 years of deception had finally settled visibly on her shoulders. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled, her silver hair escaping from its customary bun, and her clothes bore the dust of someone who had been working in forgotten corners of the archives. "Thank you for coming, Your Highness," she said quietly, her voice echoing strangely in the stone chamber. "I wasn't certain you would." William remained near the foot of the stairs, every instinct telling him to be ready to flee if necessary. "Margaret, why are you doing this? You've been like family to me. I trusted you." Margaret's laugh was bitter and filled with decades of suppressed emotion. "Family? Your Highness, you have no idea what family means when you're the one keeping its darkest secrets." She gestured to a chair across from her at the table. "Please sit. You deserve to know the complete truth before you decide what to do about it." Against his better judgment, William moved closer and took the offered seat. The table between them was covered with documents he had never seen before. Photographs, letters, official reports, and what appeared to be personal journals. Some of the papers looked ancient, while others were clearly recent additions to the collection. "Dr. Hartwell told you about Sir Charles Pemberton," Margaret began without preamble. "But she doesn't know the whole story. She doesn't know why I've spent 40 years protecting your family while preparing to destroy it." William stared at her across the flickering lamplight. "What are you talking about?" Margaret reached for a leather-bound journal and opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "This belonged to your grandmother, your father's biological mother, the woman who died on the night of your birth." She turned the journal toward William, revealing pages covered in elegant handwriting that seemed to dance in the lamplight. As he read, William felt his understanding of his family's history shifting once again. "My name is Catherine Morrison." The journal entry began, dated 3 days before William's birth. "I am recording this in case something happens to me before I can tell my son the truth about his parentage and his right to claim his place in the royal succession." William looked up sharply. "Morrison? As in James Morrison, the archivist?" Margaret's smile was sad and proud. "James Morrison was my brother, Your Highness. Catherine Morrison was my mother." The revelation hit William like a physical blow. Everything he thought he knew about the relationships and motivations behind the events of 40 years ago was suddenly transformed. Margaret wasn't an outsider who had stumbled onto family secrets. She was family herself, with her own legitimate claim to royal blood. "Your mother was my grandmother?" William whispered. "Yes. And my brother James wasn't trying to blackmail your family or expose secrets for personal gain. He was trying to protect our mother's memory and ensure that her son, your father, knew the truth about his heritage." Margaret turned several pages in the journal, revealing more of Catherine Morrison's careful records. She had been documenting everything for years, keeping proof of her relationship with your grandfather and evidence of the royal acknowledgement of her son's legitimacy. William read on, his hands shaking as the implications became clear. According to Catherine Morrison's journal, her relationship with William's grandfather had been more than a casual affair. They had been secretly married in a private ceremony, making William's father not just a royal bastard but a legitimate heir who had been denied his birthright. "This is impossible," William said, though even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't. "If this is true, if they were married, then your father is not just the legitimate king, he's the rightful king. And you are his legitimate heir through a bloodline that has never been questioned." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes intense in the lamplight. "But it also means that your grandfather's official marriage was bigamous, and everyone who came after it has a questionable claim to the throne." The constitutional implications were staggering. If Catherine Morrison's marriage to William's grandfather was valid, then the entire succession that had followed was built on lies. The current monarch's legitimacy would be in question, along with everyone else in the line of succession except William and his father. "Why didn't your mother reveal this while she was alive?" William asked. because she loved my grandfather more than she loved power. She agreed to keep their marriage secret to protect the stability of the monarchy, on the condition that her son would be acknowledged and given a place in the succession. Margaret's voice carried 40 years of anger and frustration. But after your grandfather's death, his advisors decided that the secret was too dangerous to honor. William was beginning to understand the full scope of the conspiracy that had shaped his family's history. So they tried to bury the evidence and pretend the marriage never happened. Exactly. And when my mother threatened to go public on the night of your birth, Sir Charles Pemberton decided she had to be silenced permanently. Margaret reached for another document, this one a police report that had clearly been altered. The car accident wasn't an accident, Your Highness. My mother was murdered to protect a lie. William stared at the police report, noting the discrepancies that Margaret had circled in red ink. The official investigation had concluded that icy roads had caused the accident, but the weather reports from that night showed clear skies and temperatures well above freezing. The autopsy had found evidence of alcohol in Catherine Morrison's blood, but hospital records showed she had been a lifelong teetotaler. My brother James discovered the inconsistencies in the police report, Margaret continued. He was trying to gather enough evidence to demand a proper investigation when Sir Charles had him killed as well. And you've known about this for 40 years? William asked, his voice hollow with shock. I've known, and I've been waiting for the right moment to get justice for my family. But I also understood what revealing the truth would do to the monarchy and to you personally. Margaret's expression softened slightly. Despite everything, Your Highness, I've watched you grow up. I've seen the kind of man you've become, and I've struggled with whether exposing the truth is worth destroying your life. William looked around the ancient vault at the stone walls that had witnessed centuries of royal secrets and betrayals. Is that what this is about? Justice for your mother and brother? Partly, but it's also about something else, something that changes everything. Margaret reached for a final document, this one bearing official seals and signatures that William recognized as belonging to current government officials. 3 days ago, I received this from the Prime Minister's office. William read the document with growing disbelief. It was an order for Margaret's immediate arrest on charges of treason and conspiracy against the crown. The evidence cited included her access to classified royal documents and her alleged connections to foreign intelligence services seeking information about royal succession. They know about your investigation, Margaret said quietly. Someone has been watching your meetings with Sir Henry and Dr. Hartwell, and they've decided that I'm a security threat who needs to be eliminated. William felt the walls of the vault closing in around him. Who's behind this? The same people who have been protecting the lie for 40 years. The current monarch's advisors, government officials who benefit from the status quo, anyone who would lose power if the truth about the legitimate succession came out. Margaret's voice carried a note of desperation. They're planning to frame me for the blackmail attempts and have me arrested before I can reveal what I know. But you're behind the blackmail attempts, William pointed out. Margaret shook her head. No, Your Highness. I sent you the charred fragments because I wanted you to discover the truth yourself, to make your own decisions about what to do with it. But the blackmail demands came from someone else, someone who's using the situation to their own advantage. William felt his mind racing as he tried to piece together the competing narratives. If you're not the blackmailer, then who is? I believe it's someone within the current government who wants to use the scandal to justify major changes to the monarchy. Someone who sees this as an opportunity to either eliminate the royal family entirely or to install a more compliant heir who would serve their political purposes. The implications were terrifying. If Margaret was right, then William was caught in the middle of a conspiracy that involved not just his family's past secrets, but current political machinations that could reshape the entire British system of government. What do you want me to do? William asked. Margaret gathered the documents from the table and placed them in a leather portfolio. I want you to take this evidence and decide for yourself what the truth is worth. These documents prove that your father is the rightful king, that you are his legitimate heir, and that your family has been the victim of a 40-year conspiracy. But they also prove that revealing the truth would create a constitutional crisis that could destroy the monarchy forever. She handed him the portfolio, her hands shaking with emotion. Your Highness, in less than 2 hours, government agents will arrive to arrest me. Once I'm in custody, this evidence will disappear, and the truth about your family will be buried forever. If you're going to act on what you've learned, you need to do it tonight. William took the portfolio, feeling the weight of centuries of royal history in his hands. Every document it contained was a potential weapon that could either restore his family's legitimate claim to power or destroy the institution that had shaped British history for over 1,000 years. Margaret, there's something I don't understand. If this evidence proves my father's legitimacy, why haven't you revealed it before now? Why wait 40 years? Margaret's expression was complex, mixing love and regret in equal measure. Because I made a promise to your mother, your Highness. She begged me to protect you from the truth until you were strong enough to handle it. She knew that learning about the conspiracy that surrounded your birth would change you, and she wanted you to have a normal childhood despite everything. My mother knew about your family's connection to mine. She figured it out when you were about 5 years old. You had been asking questions about family trees and genealogy, and she realized that the archivist who was helping you research your ancestors was also connected to those ancestors. Margaret smiled sadly at the memory. She confronted me, and I told her everything. After that, we worked together to protect you while trying to find a way to honor the truth about your heritage. William felt tears forming in his eyes as he thought about his mother carrying this burden along with Margaret, both women working to protect him from secrets that could have destroyed his sense of identity. What did my mother think I should do when I learned the truth? She believed you should follow your conscience. If you felt the monarchy needed to be preserved, you should find a way to do that while honoring the legitimate succession. If you felt the truth was more important than the institution, you should have the courage to reveal it regardless of the consequences. Margaret stood, gathering her coat from the back of her chair. But, most importantly, she wanted you to know that whatever you decided, you would have the support of people who love you for who you are, not for the title you might or might not inherit. As Margaret prepared to leave the vault, William realized that his understanding of love, family, and duty had been completely transformed over the course of a few hours. The woman he had suspected of betraying him was actually his aunt, someone who had spent her entire career protecting him while seeking justice for their murdered family members. Margaret, where will you go? If they're coming to arrest you, I've made arrangements, Your Highness. If I survive the next few days, I'll find a way to contact you. But if something happens to me, promise me you'll use that evidence to find a real blackmailer and expose the people who have been manipulating your family for 40 years. William stood and embraced the woman who was both his archivist and his aunt, feeling the terrible weight of the choices that lay ahead of him. In his hands, he held the power to either restore his family's rightful place in history or to bring down the entire system that had given his life meaning and purpose. As Margaret disappeared into the darkness beyond the vault, William was left alone with the flickering oil lamps and the portfolio that contained enough secrets to reshape the British government. The charred page that had started his investigation had led him to truths more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined, and now he had less than 2 hours to decide whether to use those truths as weapons or shields. The weight of 1,000 years of royal tradition pressed down on him as he climbed the stone stairs back to the archives above. Whatever choice he made in the hours ahead would echo through generations of history, determining not just his own fate, but the future of an institution that had survived wars, revolutions, and centuries of political upheaval. But for the first time since the investigation began, William felt that he finally understood what was at stake. It wasn't just about legitimacy or succession or constitutional law. It was about love, family, and the courage to honor truth even when that truth came with a price too terrible to calculate. Dawn was breaking over Windsor Castle as William sat in his private study, surrounded by the documents that Margaret had given him and the weight of a decision that would shape the future of the British monarchy. The portfolio lay open before him, its contents scattered across his desk like pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, would either restore his family's honor or destroy everything they had worked to protect. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 6 times, marking the passage of another sleepless hour. In 12 hours, the blackmailer's deadline would expire, and William still had no clear idea who was really behind the threats or what they hoped to accomplish. But he had something more valuable than the identity of his enemy. He had the truth about his family's history and the courage to act on it. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. William's private secretary entered quietly, carrying a silver tray with tea and the morning newspapers. The man's expression was carefully neutral, but William could see the concern in his eyes as he took in the scattered documents and his employer's haggard appearance. "Your Highness, forgive the intrusion, but there's been a development. Miss Thornfield was found dead in her home early this morning. The police are treating it as a suspected suicide." The news hit William like a physical blow. He stared at his secretary in shocked disbelief, his mind refusing to process what he had just heard. Margaret, who had been so vital and determined just hours before, was gone. The woman who had spent 40 years protecting his family while seeking justice for her own was dead, taking with her any hope of learning more about the conspiracy that had shaped their lives. "Suicide?" William managed to ask. According to the initial police report, she left a note confessing to the blackmail attempts and expressing remorse for betraying the royal family's trust. She apparently took an overdose of sleeping pills sometime after midnight. William felt a cold rage building in his chest. Margaret had been murdered, just as her mother and brother had been before her. The people behind the 40-year conspiracy were still operating, still eliminating anyone who posed a threat to their carefully constructed lies. But this time, they had made a mistake. They had killed the one person who might have helped William navigate the treacherous path ahead. "Where's the supposed suicide note?" William asked. His secretary produced an evidence bag containing a handwritten letter. Even through the plastic, William could see that something was wrong with the handwriting. The penmanship was too careful, too controlled to belong to someone in the emotional state that would lead to suicide. It looked like someone had carefully copied Margaret's handwriting rather than writing naturally. "How the police finished their investigation?" William asked. "It's ongoing, Your Highness, but given the confession and the apparent method of death, they expect to close the case quickly unless new evidence emerges." William made a decision that surprised even himself. "I want to see the body." His secretary looked startled. "Your Highness, I'm not sure that would be appropriate. The police haven't released the scene yet, and I'm not asking for permission," William interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that his secretary had rarely heard before. "Margaret Thornfield served this family for 30 years. I will pay my respects to her, regardless of what the police believe about her final actions." Within an hour, William was standing in Margaret's cottage, observing details that the police had either missed or chosen to ignore. The supposed suicide note was positioned too perfectly on her desk. The sleeping pill bottle was too clean to have been handled by someone in distress. And, most tellingly, Margaret's precious archives were missing from their usual places throughout the house. The police inspector in charge of the investigation was a young man who seemed intimidated by William's presence, but determined to maintain his authority. "Your Highness, everything appears consistent with suicide. Miss Thornfield was facing serious criminal charges. Her reputation was ruined, and she obviously felt tremendous guilt about her actions." William knelt beside Margaret's desk, examining the area where she supposedly wrote her final letter. "Inspector, did your team find any traces of forced entry? Any signs of a struggle?" "No, sir. The house was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of violence." "What about the timing? When exactly do you believe she died?" The inspector consulted his notes. "Based on the coroner's preliminary examination, sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. The neighbors heard nothing unusual." William stood and walked to Margaret's bedroom, where her body had been found. Something about the scene felt staged, too peaceful, and organized for someone who had chosen to end her life in despair. Margaret's clothes were neatly folded, her personal belongings arranged with the same meticulous care she had always shown in her professional work. "Inspector, I'd like to request a more thorough autopsy and investigation." Margaret Thornfield was not the kind of person who would take her own life, regardless of the circumstances she was facing. The inspector looked uncomfortable. "Your Highness, with respect, people react to pressure in unpredictable ways. The evidence indicates that someone wanted Margaret's death to look like suicide." William's voice carried the full weight of his royal authority. "I'm formally requesting that this investigation be reopened and conducted with the thoroughness that befits a potential murder case." As William left Margaret's cottage, he realized that her death had simplified his choices in some ways while complicating them in others. The people behind the conspiracy had revealed themselves through their desperation to silence her, but they had also eliminated his most valuable ally in the fight for truth and justice. The drive back to Windsor gave William time to think about his next steps. The evidence Margaret had given him was powerful, but it would be difficult to authenticate without her testimony. The real blackmailer was still out there, probably preparing to make their demands public now that Margaret had been eliminated. And somewhere in the government or royal household, there were people who had committed murder to protect their secrets and would not hesitate to kill again. By the time William reached the castle, he had made his decision. He would not allow Margaret's death to be in vain, and he would not permit the conspiracy that had destroyed his family's truth to continue unchallenged. But he would need help, and there was only one person he trusted completely to provide it. William called Sir Henry Ashworth and asked him to come to Windsor immediately. When the old man arrived an hour later, William told him everything about Margaret's true identity, about the evidence of the legitimate marriage between his grandmother Catherine Morrison and his grandfather, about the murders that had been covered up as accidents, and about the continuing conspiracy to suppress the truth. Sir Henry listened in stunned silence, his face growing paler with each revelation. When William finished his account, the old man sat quietly for several minutes before speaking. "William, if what you're telling me is true, then I've been an unwitting participant in a cover-up that has cost innocent lives and denied your family their rightful place in history." Sir Henry's voice was heavy with guilt and sorrow. "But if we act on this information, we could destroy the monarchy entirely. Or we could restore it to its legitimate foundation," William replied. "Sir Henry, I need to know something. In your heart, do you believe my grandfather's marriage to Catherine Morrison was valid?" The old man closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were filled with tears. "Yes, William, I believe it was. Your grandfather loved Catherine Morrison more than anything else in his life, including the crown. If he made the decision to marry her secretly, he would have ensured that it was legally binding. Then my father is the rightful king, and I am his legitimate heir. Yes, but revealing that truth would mean admitting that the current monarch's entire reign has been based on a lie. The constitutional crisis would be unprecedented." William walked to the window of his study, looking out at the grounds where he had played as a child, where generations of his family had lived and ruled. "Sir Henry, I've spent the past week learning that everything I believed about my family was built on lies and murder. I can't continue to live that lie, especially not when it means allowing Margaret's killers to escape justice." Sir Henry joined him at the window. "What do you propose to do?" "I'm going to call a press conference for this evening. I'm going to reveal everything. The legitimate marriage, the murders, the cover-up, all of it. I'm going to let the British people decide what they want to do with the truth. And if the monarchy doesn't survive the revelation..." William turned to face the man who had been like a grandfather to him, his expression resolute. "Then, at least it will die with honor instead of continuing to live a lie." Sir Henry studied William's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Your mother will be proud of you. She always believed that truth was more important than power. The hours leading up to the press conference passed in a blur of preparation and telephone calls. William's private secretary worked frantically to arrange the necessary logistics, while fielding increasingly urgent calls from government officials who had somehow learned of William's intentions. The Prime Minister's office requested an immediate meeting, which William politely declined. Several members of the royal family called to express their concerns, but William told them all the same thing. They would learn the truth along with everyone else. As evening approached, William dressed carefully in a simple dark suit that seemed appropriate for the gravity of what he was about to do. The evidence that Margaret had given him was arranged in a leather folder that he carried with him as he made his way to the press room that had been hastily set up in one of the castle's reception halls. The gathered reporters sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen. William's press conferences were usually routine affairs, focused on charitable activities or official announcements. But the formal setting and the obvious security presence suggested that tonight would be different. William took his place behind the podium and looked out at the sea of faces and cameras that would carry his words around the world. He thought of Margaret, lying dead in her cottage after a lifetime of protecting secrets that were about to be revealed. He thought of his grandmother, Catherine Morrison, murdered on the night of his birth for threatening to tell the truth. He thought of James Morrison, killed for asking the right questions about royal legitimacy. "Ladies and gentlemen," William began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "Tonight, I want to tell you a story about love, family, and the price of truth. It's a story that begins 40 years ago with a charred page that turned up in the royal archives, and it ends tonight with my decision to honor the memory of people who died protecting the secrets I'm about to share with you." For the next hour, William methodically presented the evidence that Margaret had preserved for 4 decades. He showed the documentation of his grandfather's secret marriage to Catherine Morrison, explained the murders that had been covered up as accidents, and revealed the conspiracy that had shaped British royal history for an entire generation. The reaction in the press room was electric. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed constantly, and the magnitude of the constitutional implications began to sink in for everyone present. But William continued his presentation with calm dignity, allowing the facts to speak for themselves without commentary or interpretation. When he finished, William closed the leather folder and looked directly into the cameras that were broadcasting his words around the world. "I am revealing this information not to destroy the monarchy, but to restore it to a foundation of truth and legitimacy. My father is the rightful king of England, and I am his legitimate heir. But more importantly, the British people deserve to know the complete truth about the institution that governs their nation." The questions that followed were intense and probing, but William answered each one with honesty and directness. He acknowledged that his revelations would create a constitutional crisis, but he argued that a monarchy built on lies could never truly serve the people it was meant to represent. As the press conference concluded and the reporters rushed to file their stories, William felt a profound sense of relief washing over him. The burden of secrets that had shaped his entire life was finally lifted, and whatever happened next, he would face it with the truth as his foundation.